Picture a man on his hands and knees in the Judean desert, not standing at the entrance of a cave, not shining a light through a doorway, on his hands and knees, pressing his shoulders into a crack in the face of a limestone cliff, pulling himself forward through the dark. The crack is barely wide enough for a human body. Inside, the air has not moved in a very long time, dry the way only desert air can be dry, still the way only sealed places can be still. When his eyes adjust, he does not see what anyone imagined. No shelves, no ceramic jars standing in rows, no scrolls wrapped in linen waiting to be found. He sees the floor, and the floor is covered in pieces. Thousands of them, fragments of leather and papyrus, some no larger than a fingernail, lying in the dust, as if someone had carried an entire library into this small dark space, and the library had simply come apart over the centuries, slowly and silently, until nothing whole remained. That is Cave 4. That is what they found in 1952. And here is the question that no one had a ready answer for. How could the most broken, most fragment-filled cave in the entire Qumran complex turn out to be the single most important discovery in the history of biblical scholarship? That is what we are here to find out. Let us begin by clearing something up. You have almost certainly heard a version of this story. A young Bedouin shepherd wandering along the cliffs above the Dead Sea. A stone thrown into a dark opening. The sound of something breaking inside. A cave full of ancient jars. A discovery that would change the world. That story is true, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. And the parts that get left out change how we understand everything that followed. The year was 1947. The location was the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, one of the most inhospitable stretches of landscape in the Middle East. The hills there are pale limestone, carved by centuries of erosion into a maze of ravines and shallow caves. The air holds almost no moisture at any time of year. In summer, the heat comes off the rock in visible waves. In winter, the cold arrives off the water with surprising sharpness. A young man named Muhammad Ed-Dib was moving his flock along those cliffs when he threw a stone into a dark opening and heard a sound he did not expect. Not the hollow echo of an empty cave. Something breaking. Something ceramic. He came back the next day with a friend. They climbed in and found tall ceramic jars, some of them still sealed, and inside some of those jars, ancient scrolls wrapped in deteriorating linen. They had found what would later be called Cave 1, not Cave 4. This distinction matters more than it might seem. Cave 1 gave the world something extraordinary and something immediately legible. Among the scrolls pulled from those jars was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah. All 66 chapters, written on 17 sheets of leather, stitched together into a scroll nearly 24 feet long, the oldest surviving manuscript of any complete biblical book, predating the next oldest known copy by approximately 1,000 years. There was also the community rule, the war scroll, the Thanksgiving hymns, whole texts, legible texts, complete columns of ancient writing that scholars could photograph, transcribe, and begin to analyze within months of their discovery. When these scrolls reached scholars, the reaction was something close to controlled astonishment. The Isaiah scroll alone was a discovery of the first order. Here was physical proof that the Hebrew scriptures had been transmitted with extraordinary care across a millennium. Word for word, line for line, the text matched what medieval scribes had produced. 1,000 years later, the world paid attention, but Cave 1 was, in a specific and important way, a misdirection. Because Cave 1 set an expectation. If the first cave yielded complete scrolls in sealed jars, surely the others would too. More whole texts, more sealed vessels, more tidy archaeological packages waiting to be opened and read. Over the next 5 years, archaeologists and local Bedouin, often racing each other across the same terrain, found and excavated 10 more caves in the cliffs around Qumran. Cave 3 gave scholars the famous Copper Scroll, a list of buried treasures inscribed on sheets of rolled copper, a text so specific and so strange that scholars still argue about whether it should be taken literally. Cave 11 gave scholars another nearly complete Psalms scroll and a remarkable temple scroll that would turn out to be the longest single manuscript in the entire collection. The expectations set by Cave 1 were being met, more or less. And then came Cave 4. It was discovered in 1952, once again by Bedouin from the Ta'amire tribe, who had been systematically searching the cliffs. The cave sat in the face of the Marl Terrace, the soft earthen slope rising directly behind the ruins of the Qumran settlement. You could stand inside it and look down at the buildings where the community had lived. The proximity was almost too neat. When the archaeological team arrived shortly after the initial discovery, they could see immediately that the cave had already been entered and partially worked. The Bedouin had recognized that the fragments scattered across the floor had value, and they had begun collecting them for sale to antiquities dealers operating in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. By the time formal excavation of Cave 4 was completed, the material was in pieces in more than one sense. Physically, the manuscripts had deteriorated into thousands of fragments over 2 millennia. Practically, those fragments were now moving through an informal market, being sold individually, dispersed across multiple collections. The team, led by Roland Deveau, a French Dominican priest and archaeologist who directed the École Biblique in Jerusalem, spent years and considerable funds purchasing fragments back from dealers. Piece by piece, what they eventually assembled was nothing like what Cave 1 had suggested they would find. No complete scrolls, no sealed jars with intact contents, no beautiful continuous columns of text ready to be photographed and published. Fragments, more than 15,000 of them. Pieces of leather and papyrus in every state of preservation, from surprisingly legible to nearly disintegrated, representing somewhere between 200 and 220 separate manuscripts. One cave, a crack in the cliff barely wide enough for a man to enter on his hands and knees, and inside it, nearly 40% of everything ever recovered at Qumran. The initial reaction among some members of the scholarly team was close to dismay. The dream of Cave 1 had shaped what everyone hoped to find. Cave 4 did not deliver that dream. It delivered something messier, something harder, something that would require decades of painstaking work before its full significance could even begin to emerge. What nobody fully understood in those first years of excavation was this: the incompleteness of Cave 4 was not a problem to be overcome. It was a message about the nature of what they had found. There is a number at the center of the Cave 4 story that does not get smaller the more you sit with it. 15,000. Not scrolls, not manuscripts, fragments. individual pieces of ancient writing material, some no larger than a postage stamp, some large enough to hold several legible lines of text, all of them lying in the dust of a cave sealed for nearly 2 millennia. To understand what those 15,000 pieces represent, you need to understand the work of reconstruction that followed their recovery. When the fragments were brought to the Palestine Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem, conservators and scholars faced a task with almost no precedent in the history of scholarship. They needed to determine, from physical and textual evidence alone, how many separate manuscripts had originally existed in the cave, and which fragments belonged to which manuscript. The tools available were basic by any standard. Scholars examined the color and texture of each piece of leather or papyrus, trying to identify materials that had come from the same original document. They analyzed handwriting, comparing letterforms across thousands of tiny surfaces. They studied the language of each fragment, distinguishing between Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. They looked for physical edges that matched, for columns of text that continued across separate pieces, for ink that had transferred from one fragment onto the surface of another when the manuscript was still folded and pressed together. It was work that required extraordinary patience, extraordinary eyesight, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty for very long periods of time. It proceeded across decades. It is, in some areas, still proceeding today. What emerged from that reconstruction effort was a picture of the Cave 4 collection that transformed scholarly understanding of the ancient world. 200 to 220 distinct manuscripts in one cave, representing nearly 40% of everything recovered across all 11 caves at Qumran. But the number of manuscripts is only the beginning of the story. What those manuscripts contain is what changes the picture entirely. Among the Cave 4 fragments, scholars identified portions of virtually every book of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the Psalms, the books of Samuel and Kings, the minor prophets, book after book, represented in fragments that stretched across centuries of copying and transmission. The only notable absence was the Book of Esther, and whether that absence reflects deliberate exclusion or simple accident of preservation remains an open question. The presence of so much biblical material confirmed something scholars had long believed but never been able to demonstrate so directly. The community at Qumran, whatever else they were deeply and systematically engaged with the scriptural tradition of their people. This was not a collection assembled casually. It was built with purpose. But alongside the biblical texts, Cave 4 contained something equally important and considerably more unexpected: non-biblical manuscripts, texts that do not appear in any modern Bible, in any tradition, anywhere in the world. Among them were the Pesharim, a Hebrew term for biblical commentaries in which the community applied prophetic texts directly to their own historical situation. The Qumran community read Isaiah and Habakkuk and Nahum not as accounts of a distant past, but as coded descriptions of their own present. Their teacher was the teacher mentioned in the ancient prophecy. Their enemies were the enemies the prophet had described. Their moment in history was the moment the ancient words had been waiting to address. The commentary on Habakkuk found among the Cave 4 material is one of the most remarkable documents in the entire collection. It is a window into how a community reads Scripture when it believes itself to be living at the center of its fulfillment. There were legal texts, detailed and sophisticated arguments about the correct interpretation of Jewish law. One document, in particular, known by its Hebrew abbreviation as MMT, presented what appeared to be a formal letter laying out a series of legal rulings on matters of ritual purity and temple practice. It was addressed to an opponent, possibly the leadership of the Jerusalem temple itself. The tone was precise, and the disagreements were specific. These were people who knew the law deeply and disagreed about it with equal depth. There were liturgical texts, prayers and hymns of striking literary quality, compositions suggesting a community not merely following an inherited tradition of worship, but actively generating new forms of religious poetry. The Hodayot, or Thanksgiving hymns, preserved in Cave 4 in multiple fragmentary copies, contain language of intense personal devotion that scholars have compared to the Psalms in its emotional range and literary craft. There were apocalyptic texts, visions of cosmic warfare, descriptions of angelic hierarchies, accounts of a final confrontation between the forces of God and the forces of darkness. These were not marginal additions to the collection. They were central to it. The community that built this library believed it was living in the last chapter of history, and its texts reflected that belief at every level. And there were texts belonging to neither the biblical tradition nor the specific sectarian literature of Qumran, but to a broader world of Jewish religious writing from the Second Temple period that history had largely forgotten. The Book of Enoch appeared in Cave 4 in multiple Aramaic fragments representing 5 separate manuscripts. This is the same text that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has read as scripture for 1600 years. The same text whose presence in Ethiopia we explored in an earlier video. At Qumran, it was not a curiosity. It was part of the library's core. The Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis and Exodus with a distinctive theological emphasis on the solar calendar and the eternal validity of the covenant with Israel, appeared in fragments of at least 14 or 15 separate manuscripts, more copies than almost any other non-biblical text in the entire collection. 14 or 15 manuscripts of a single text in a library of roughly 200. That is not casual ownership. That is deep investment. That is a community returning to a text again and again, finding in it something they needed to keep finding. Hold all of that together and ask the question that Cave 4 makes unavoidable. What kind of library is this? It is not the library of a community with a simple, fixed relationship to its tradition. It is the library of a community engaged in a vast, living conversation with an enormous range of religious texts. Biblical texts in multiple versions, legal texts arguing the boundaries of the law, prophetic commentaries insisting on the immediate relevance of ancient words, hymns generated fresh from inside the tradition, apocalyptic visions of a world about to end, texts that later history would carry forward, alongside texts that later history would set aside. All of it together, all of it in one small cave. And among the biblical manuscripts in Cave 4, scholars found something that took years to fully absorb. They found different versions of the same books. Not different copies of the same version, different versions. The book of Jeremiah was the clearest example. Cave 4 contained fragments matching the standard Hebrew text of Jeremiah, familiar from the medieval manuscript tradition. It also contained fragments of a version of Jeremiah that was noticeably shorter, organized differently, with passages appearing in a different sequence. Scholars recognized immediately what they were looking at. The ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Septuagint, had always contained a version of Jeremiah significantly shorter than the standard Hebrew. For centuries, the conventional explanation had been that the Greek translators had abbreviated the text. What Cave 4 showed was something different. There had existed, in ancient times, a shorter Hebrew version of Jeremiah. The Greek translators had not abbreviated anything. They had faithfully translated a different source. The same pattern appeared in Exodus, in Samuel, in Numbers, in the Psalms. In each case, Cave 4 produced evidence of textual variation that went beyond scribal error and into genuine textual plurality. Multiple versions of the same books, circulating simultaneously within the same community, without any apparent sense that one version was authoritative and the others were not. That discovery did not simply extend what scholars knew. It replaced the question they had been asking. The question had been, how faithfully was the Bible transmitted over the centuries? Cave 4 replaced it with a harder and more fundamental question. Before any single version became the standard, what exactly was the Bible? Before we go further into what Cave 4 contains and what it means, we need to sit with a question that sounds simple and turns out not to be. Who put it there? Not in the academic sense of which sect or which institution. In the human sense, what kind of people gather 200 manuscripts in a cave? What do they believe? What do they fear? What do they think is worth the effort of hiding? The ruins of the Qumran settlement sit at the base of the cliffs where the caves were found. A community occupied this place for roughly 2 centuries, from approximately the late 2nd century, before the Common Era, until its destruction around 68 of the Common Era, when Roman legions moved through the Jordan Valley, suppressing the Jewish revolt that would end 2 years later in the burning of the Temple in Jerusalem. The physical evidence from the ruins is specific enough to tell us certain things directly. There were ritual immersion pools, multiple of them, more than any ordinary domestic site would require. Whoever lived here practiced ritual purity with an intensity that shaped the architecture of the place. There was a large communal space that appears to have been used for shared meals. There was a room identified by the presence of inkwells and plaster writing surfaces. A scriptorium, a place where manuscripts were copied. These were people who ate together, purified themselves together, and wrote together. The physical remains of their daily life suggest a community whose religious practice was woven into every ordinary action. The texts from Cave 4 tell us what was inside that practice. They were people who had come to believe that the religious establishment of their time, centered on the temple in Jerusalem, had fallen into fundamental corruption, not minor corruption, not administrative failure, corruption at the level of the priesthood itself. The people responsible for mediating between the community of Israel and God. The community rule from Cave 4 is explicit about this. The community had withdrawn from a temple it considered defiled. It was not waiting for reform. It was waiting for replacement. They called themselves the community of the renewed covenant. They understood themselves as the faithful remnant of Israel, the part of the people that had kept true to what the covenant actually required, while the majority had allowed themselves to be led astray. This was not a mild self-understanding. It carried with it a particular kind of urgency and a particular kind of isolation. To believe you are the righteous remnant is to believe that you are surrounded, that the world outside your boundaries is in fundamental error, and that the stakes of maintaining your own faithfulness are cosmically high. The War Scroll, represented in Cave 4 in multiple related manuscripts, described in elaborate detail a final conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. This was not metaphor for them. It was expectation. They believed that history was moving toward a conclusion, that the forces of evil would make a final assault, and that the community of the righteous would stand at the center of the conflict. They had been waiting for a long time, and waiting of that kind changes how a community relates to its texts. When you believe you are living in the last chapter of history, every ancient text becomes potentially relevant to your present moment. The Pesharim from Cave 4 show exactly this. The community read Habakkuk and saw their own teacher. They read Isaiah and saw their own enemies. They read Nahum and found a description of events they recognized from their own lifetime. This is why they needed so many texts, not for scholarly completeness, not for institutional prestige, because they were reading everything they had for any indication of where they stood in the story that was about to end. And they were not reading casually. They were reading with the intensity of people who believe the texts hold the key to something genuinely urgent. The legal texts from Cave 4 add another dimension to this picture. The document, known as MMT, with its careful enumeration of legal disagreements with what appears to be the Jerusalem establishment, shows a community that did not simply reject the mainstream tradition emotionally. They rejected it through argument, through detailed legal reasoning, through the painstaking construction of a case that what the establishment was doing was wrong by the very standards the tradition itself had established. These were not people who had simply given up on the tradition. They were people who had gone deeper into it than almost anyone else and come out the other side convinced that the mainstream had gotten something fundamental wrong. Now, add to this portrait the question of the library itself. A community that small, living in that kind of isolation, under that kind of theological pressure, does not build a library of 200 manuscripts by accident. They built it because they believed certain texts were worth the effort of acquisition, copying, and preservation. They returned to certain texts so many times that 14 or 15 manuscript copies of a single work accumulated in their collection. They preserved texts that were moving toward the edges of the wider Jewish canon, texts like Enoch and Jubilees. Not as curiosities, but as scriptures they considered authoritative. They were making decisions about what belonged in their tradition and what did not. And they were making those decisions not from a position of institutional power, but from a position of deliberate separation from institutional power. Their canon was shaped not by what the temple authorities had decided, but by what they, in their reading and their argument and their prayer, had found to be true. And then, at some point in 68 of the Common Era, the Romans came. What happened next is something we have to read from physical evidence rather than testimony, because no one from the community survived to describe it. What we know is that the manuscripts were not destroyed in the attack. They were hidden before it, distributed across 11 separate caves, wrapped in linen, sealed in jars where the materials allowed for it. The distribution itself suggests planning. Someone made decisions about which texts went where. Someone understood that hiding everything in one place was a risk that dispersal could reduce. This was not the action of a community caught off guard. It was the action of a community that had thought seriously, probably for a long time, about what it would do when the moment of danger arrived. They saved the library. They could not save themselves. The settlement was destroyed. The community disappeared from history without leaving any account of what happened to them. The desert took the landscape back. The cave stood silent above the ruins for 19 centuries. What the community feared has come to pass in the most literal possible way. The world they were trying to preserve against had won. The temple was gone. The sect was gone. The tradition they had worked to maintain in its true form was gone. What remained was the library, 15,000 pieces of it, in the smallest cave, waiting in the dark. Here is something that tends to produce a particular kind of silence when people first encounter it. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947. The complete contents of Cave 4 were not available to the general scholarly community until 1991. 44 years. In those 4 decades, some of the most significant ancient manuscripts ever discovered were accessible to only a small, self-selected group of scholars. The broader academic community, the historians and theologians and linguists and archaeologists who had devoted their professional lives to exactly the questions that Cave 4 could illuminate, could not see the material, could not study it, could not publish analyses of it, could not verify that descriptions of it were accurate. And the situation persisted. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to the circumstances of the early 1950s, when Cave 4 was excavated and its fragments painstakingly acquired from the antiquities market. The political situation in Jerusalem was complicated in ways that had direct consequences for the scrolls. The city had been divided since the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. The Cave 4 material ended up housed in the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem. At that time, under Jordanian administration, an international team assembled to work on the scrolls was placed under the direction of Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican priest and respected archaeologist who directed the École Biblique in Jerusalem. De Vaux divided the Cave 4 fragments among the members of his team. Each scholar took responsibility for a portion of the material, with the expectation that they would produce a complete scholarly edition within a time frame that remained, in practice, undefined. Some scholars produced their assigned texts efficiently. Others did not. A few held their assigned material for decades without producing a complete edition. The reasons they gave varied. The genuine difficulty of the work, the demands of other professional obligations, the need for further study before publication could responsibly proceed. The Cave 4 fragments were, in many cases, extraordinarily difficult to read and interpret, requiring skills that very few people possessed and time that academic life does not always provide in abundance. These explanations were not entirely without merit, but the cumulative effect of individual delays was a collective failure of access that lasted far longer than the difficulty of the work could justify. By the 1970s, the frustration outside the official team had moved from irritation to something with a sharper edge. Scholars who needed the Cave 4 material could not get it. Requests to see the original fragments were routinely denied. Requests for photographs were handled with inconsistency. The official publication series moved at a pace that bore no visible relationship to the urgency of the material. Vermes, a distinguished Oxford scholar of Jewish history and one of the most respected voices in the field, chose his words carefully in 1977 when he described the situation as the academic scandal of the century. That phrase entered the conversation about the scrolls and did not leave it for 15 years. In the absence of information, something predictable happened. Speculation filled the space. Some scholars and journalists began asking whether the delay was deliberate in a specific and pointed sense. Several members of the original team were Catholic clergy. The institution overseeing much of the early work had close ties to Catholic biblical scholarship. Was it possible that the unpublished Cave 4 material contained texts that religious institutions preferred not to see in public circulation? Books appeared arguing exactly that. Titles reached bestseller lists, claiming that the scrolls contained suppressed revelations about Jesus, about the origins of Christianity, about a relationship between the Qumran community and the earliest followers of the new faith that someone powerful had decided the world should not know. The word suppression appeared frequently. The phrase, "what they did not want you to know," became a publishing formula applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls with increasing frequency and decreasing precision. Most of this was not supported by the available evidence. Scholars who had seen portions of the unpublished material reported nothing of the theologically explosive character that the popular accounts promised. But in the absence of full public access, there was no way to definitively close the argument. The conditions for sustained suspicion were ideal. A small group with exclusive access, an institution with institutional interests, decades of delay without adequate explanation, a subject of religious significance to billions of people. The mechanism that finally broke the situation open did not come from within the official structure of the project. It came from a library in California. The Huntington Library in San Marino had, over a period of years, obtained a complete set of photographic negatives of the Cave 4 material through channels the library declined to describe in detail. In September of 1991, the library's director announced that the Huntington would make its photographic archive available to any qualified scholar who requested access, without restriction, and without seeking permission from the official team. The announcement landed in the scholarly community with considerable force. The official team objected. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, which had assumed formal jurisdiction over the material following the Israeli administration of East Jerusalem after 1967, found itself caught between legal principle and practical reality. Within weeks, facing the fact that the material was now effectively public, the authority lifted its restrictions. A complete photographic edition of the unpublished Cave 4 fragments was compiled and distributed. 44 years of limited access ended in a matter of months. The scholarly community finally had what it had been waiting for. And here is what they found. No suppressed Gospels. No hidden texts about Jesus. No documents that any religious institution had possessed a theological motive to suppress. The conspiracy theories that had accumulated in the vacuum of non-access found no foundation in the actual material. What the full Cave 4, and more lasting, it contained evidence of a world that the traditions we inherited had left behind. A world in which the scriptural tradition was still plural, still contested, still alive in ways that the finished canons of both Judaism and Christianity had closed off by the time they took their final forms. The delay had not protected a secret. It had postponed a reckoning with origins that the full evidence made unavoidable. That reckoning, when it finally arrived, changed the field permanently. Before 1947, the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible in the possession of modern scholarship was a document known as the Codex Leningradensis, produced in Cairo in the year 1008 or 1009 of the Common Era. 1009. It is a magnificent object, written on vellum in a precise and careful hand, fully vocalized according to the tradition of the Masoretes, the medieval Jewish scholars who devoted themselves to the exact transmission of the scriptural text. It represents the culmination of centuries of scribal care, and for a very long time, it was the foundation of virtually all scholarly work on the Hebrew scriptural tradition. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed that foundation permanently. The manuscripts from Qumran pushed the physical evidence for the Hebrew scriptural text back by approximately 1,000 years. Suddenly, scholars had manuscripts of biblical books dating to the 3rd century, the 2nd century, and in some cases the 1st century before the Common Era. Not summaries, not references, actual manuscripts, copied by actual hands, in the actual period when the scriptural tradition was still forming. The question this created was obvious and urgent. When scholars compared the Qumran manuscripts against the Codex Leningradensis, what did they find? Had the text changed significantly across that 1,000-year gap? Had the scribal tradition faithfully transmitted what it received? Or had the text drifted in ways that remained invisible until now? The answer was, first, deeply reassuring. In the majority of cases, the agreement between the Qumran biblical manuscripts and the medieval text was remarkable. The same words, the same verses, the same sequences of material. The scribal tradition that had transmitted the Hebrew Bible across a millennium had done its work with a fidelity that the physical evidence now confirmed in a way that had never before been possible. For communities of faith, this confirmation carried real weight. The text they read was recognizably the same text that had been read 2,000 years earlier. The chain of transmission had held, but the story did not stop there, because alongside the manuscripts that confirmed the received text, Cave 4 contained manuscripts that did not. The clearest example was the Book of Jeremiah. For centuries, scholars had been puzzled by a discrepancy between the Hebrew text of Jeremiah and the ancient Greek translation known as the Septuagint. The Septuagint version of Jeremiah was considerably shorter than the Hebrew. Whole passages present in the Hebrew did not appear in the Greek. Several chapters appeared in a different order. The differences were not minor, and they were not the kind of variation that could be attributed to translators making small adjustments. The conventional explanation had been that the Greek translators had abbreviated the text, that they had condensed a longer Hebrew source, that the Hebrew was original and the Greek was a derivative simplification. Cave 4 overturned this explanation. Among the Cave 4 fragments of Jeremiah, scholars identified 2 distinct types of manuscript. Some fragments matched the standard longer Hebrew text familiar from the medieval tradition. Others matched a shorter Hebrew version, a version that corresponded closely not to the longer Hebrew, but to the Greek Septuagint. The implication was unambiguous. The Septuagint translators had not abbreviated anything. They had translated a different Hebrew text, a shorter version of Jeremiah that had existed alongside the longer version, being copied and read and transmitted and eventually disappeared from the mainstream of Hebrew manuscript culture, while the longer version became standard. This was not a minor finding. For centuries, the relationship between the Hebrew and Greek scriptural traditions had been understood in terms of original and translation. The Hebrew was primary. The Greek was derivative. Differences between them reflected the choices, or failures, of the translators. Cave 4 complicated that picture in ways that have not fully settled since. If the shorter Jeremiah was not a Greek abbreviation but a different Hebrew text, then the history of the Jeremiah tradition was more complex than anyone had assumed. Two versions had coexisted. Both had been read and copied by communities who found them authoritative. And at some point, through processes that left almost no direct evidence, one version had prevailed and the other had receded. The same pattern appeared elsewhere in the Cave 4 material. Fragments of Samuel's supported readings known from the Greek Septuagint but absent from the standard Hebrew. The text of Exodus showed influence from a tradition preserved in the Samaritan Pentateuch, a version of the first 5 books of the Bible maintained by the Samaritan community and long treated by mainstream scholarship as a sectarian deviation. Cave 4 suggested the relationship was more complex. What had been treated as a deviation had roots in ancient textual traditions that predated the emergence of the sectarian divisions that later made it look like a deviation. Fragments of Psalms pointed toward a period when the collection of Psalms was not yet fixed in its final canonical form, when the boundaries of inclusion and the sequence of arrangement were still being decided. Hold all of this together, and a picture emerges that was simply not visible before the Cave 4 material became available. In the centuries immediately before and during the early Common Era, the scriptural tradition of Judaism was not a single text with a clear and settled form. It was a family of related texts, sharing the vast majority of their content, but varying in ways that were meaningful to the communities that read them. Different communities in different locations read different versions of the same books. Different scribal traditions preserved different readings. And the process by which those multiple versions converged into the single received text, the text that became the foundation of both the Jewish scriptural canon and the Christian Old Testament, was a process that unfolded gradually across the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. Under the pressure of historical crisis and the need for communal definition, the destruction of the Temple in 70 of the Common Era, the catastrophic failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, the gradual emergence of Rabbinic Judaism as the dominant form of Jewish practice, the parallel emergence of Christianity as a distinct movement with its own relationship to the Hebrew Scriptures. All of these forces push toward standardization, toward the selection of a single authoritative text, toward the closing of boundaries that Cave 4 showed had once been genuinely open. There is one further dimension of this that connects directly to the history of early Christianity. The New Testament was written in Greek. Its authors quoted the Hebrew Scriptures extensively, and in many cases they quoted from the Septuagint rather than from the Hebrew. In several instances, the Septuagint text they quoted differed from the standard Hebrew in ways that had theological significance for their arguments about Jesus and the fulfillment of prophecy. Scholars had long noted this tension. Early Christian writers appeared to be using a Greek text that differed from the authoritative Hebrew. This created problems for readers who assumed the Hebrew was always original and the Greek always secondary. Cave 4 offered a resolution. In at least some of the cases where the Septuagint differed from the standard Hebrew, the Cave 4 manuscripts showed that the Septuagint was reflecting an ancient Hebrew variant that had genuinely existed. The early Christian writers were not misquoting or mistranslating. They were drawing on a Greek text that was a faithful translation of a Hebrew tradition that the later standardization process had not carried forward into the mainstream. The scriptural world in which Christianity emerged was the plural, living, contested world that Cave 4 preserved in 15,000 pieces. It was not the standardized canonical world that later tradition made it appear to have been. Knowing that changes something about how we read the ancient texts. Not just the texts that made it through the process of standardization, the world that produced them, the arguments that surrounded them, the choices that were made, under pressure, by communities living through historical moments they could not fully control. Cave 4 is where you can stand closest to that world. Before the choices were finalized, before the boundaries were drawn, before the tradition became the tradition we inherited. There is a room at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem built specifically to hold one object. It is called the Shrine of the Book. The roof is shaped like the lid of one of the ceramic jars found in Cave 1. White ceramic, curved and domed, rising to a blunted point. The design asks you to think about preservation, about what it means to seal something against time. Inside, the centerpiece is the great Isaiah scroll from Cave 1. Nearly 24 feet of continuous text, 66 chapters, every column present, every line legible. It is one of the most complete ancient manuscripts in existence. And it is, in a very specific sense, the public face of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the image that appears on book covers and museum exhibitions and documentary films, the object that represents what the discovery meant. Cave 4 produced no great Isaiah scroll. Cave 4 produced boxes. When the fragments were sorted and laid out for examination, scholars worked at long tables with glass surfaces and light sources mounted underneath. The fragments were arranged on these light tables and examined with magnifying lenses. One piece at a time, scholars moved among them slowly, looking for edges that matched, surfaces that continued, letters that completed words. Two pieces placed together, a word recovered, a phrase made whole. Then the next piece, the next attempt, the next question. More than 70 years after the initial excavation of Cave 4, a substantial portion of the material remains incompletely identified. The official publication series ran to 40 volumes over several decades of work by dozens of scholars across multiple countries and institutions. New analyses continue to appear. New identifications are still being made, revised, and contested. The work does not end. A complete text gives you a conclusion. It tells you what a tradition decided to carry forward and how it decided to present what it carried. The great Isaiah scroll from Cave 1 is extraordinary precisely because it shows you something that came through intact, something finished, something that made it. The fragments of Cave 4 show you something different. They show you the inside of the process that produced the finished things. 15,000 pieces from 200 manuscripts do not add up to a single complete picture. They add up to evidence of a tradition that was. At the moment, those manuscripts were copied and read and eventually hidden, still working through the questions that every living community of faith must eventually answer. What do these ancient words mean for us? Here, now, which texts carry the authority we need? How do we read what we have inherited in light of what we are living through? The Pesharim from Cave 4 are the clearest evidence of this. The community was not reading Habakkuk as a historical document about a distant past. They were reading it as a message addressed to their present moment. The teacher mentioned in the ancient words was their teacher. The enemy described in the prophecy was their enemy. The meaning of the text was inseparable from the life of the community reading it. This is not a primitive or unsophisticated way to read. It is the way communities read when the stakes are high enough, when they believe the text is alive in the way a community can only believe when it is in the middle of something that feels like the end. The multiple copies of the Book of Jubilees, 14 or 15 manuscripts of a single text, tell a similar story from a different angle. This was not a community that read Jubilees once and filed it away. They returned to it. They copied it again. They found in it something they needed to keep finding. The text was not a reference. It was a companion to the life they were living. And then the Romans came. The community hid what it had built and did not survive to retrieve it. The tradition they had worked to maintain in what they believed was its true form did not continue. The manuscripts they had copied so many times ended up in fragments in the back of a small dark cave. What survived of the wider tradition is what we have inherited, the texts that found their communities of transmission. The books that continued to be copied after Qumran fell silent, the versions that prevailed through the process of standardization. The canon that emerged from the decisions made at Yavne and in the early church councils and in the long, slow accumulation of what communities chose to carry. The texts that did not make it through that process were not rejected as false by any single authority in any single moment. Most of them simply stopped being copied, stopped finding communities willing to carry them forward, receded from the mainstream through the ordinary, devastating process by which things that lack living custodians are eventually lost. Cave 4 preserved a snapshot of the moment before that process completed. A moment when Enoch and Jubilees and the community rule and the Pesharim and multiple versions of Jeremiah were all still in the conversation together, all still being read, all still mattering to people who were making their own choices about what their tradition required of them. That snapshot does not diminish what survived. It extends it. It shows the tradition in a form that the finished canon cannot show. Alive and contested and plural and urgent. The way a living thing is before it becomes a monument. The 40% of Cave 4 fragments that remain incompletely identified are not a problem awaiting a final solution. They are a permanent reminder that the record of what was thought and read and believed in that ancient world is not fully recoverable. Too much deteriorated in the 2 millennia before the material was found. Too many pieces became dust before any modern eye could read them. What remains is a fraction of what existed, and the fraction is still being read. Scholars are still at the light tables. New imaging technologies are making visible ink that was unreadable a generation ago. Pieces that were thought to be blank surfaces are turning out to carry text. Identifications that were considered settled are being revised in the light of new analysis. The community that built the library in Cave 4 believed it was preserving something against a future it feared. They were right to fear it. Everything they feared came true. The temple burned. The community died. The world they had tried to hold together came apart. But the library survived. Imperfectly, partially, in pieces that are still being placed, one fragment at a time, into a picture that will never be entirely complete. That is not a failure of preservation. It is an accurate reflection of what the ancient world actually was. We started in the dark, a man pressing his body through a crack in a limestone cliff, the stillness inside, the floor covered in fragments, thousands of pieces of something that had once been whole, lying in the dust of a space barely large enough to hold a human being. We know now what that cave held. We know that the 15,000 fragments on that floor came from 200 separate manuscripts, representing nearly half of everything ever found at Qumran. We know that among those fragments were multiple versions of the same scriptural books, evidence of a textual world more plural and more alive with argument than the finished canon could show. We know that the community which built that library believed it was the faithful remnant of its people, living at the edge of history. Preserving the true form of a tradition it watched the wider world get wrong. We know that it took 44 years for the world to gain access to what that cave contained. Not because of suppression, not because of conspiracy, because of the ordinary human failures of gatekeeping and institutional inertia. And the consequence of those failures was 4 decades of delay in a reckoning that changed the field of biblical scholarship permanently when it finally arrived. We know that the reckoning did not reveal any hidden gospel, did not confirm any of the theories that had accumulated in the vacuum of non-access, did not overturn any tradition. What it did was show us a world in which the texts we call the Bible were not yet finished, becoming themselves. A world in which multiple versions of the same books circulated alongside each other without any single version having settled its authority over the others. A world in which communities of deeply serious people read and copied and argued over and preserved texts that later history would set aside, alongside texts that later history would carry forward. A world that existed before the choices were finalized, that gave us the tradition we inherited. And here is what sitting with that world for any length of time eventually does to you. It makes you aware, in a way that finished texts cannot make you aware, that everything you have received was carried to you by people, not by institutions alone, not by councils and canonical decisions alone, but by people who found certain texts necessary enough to copy them one more time, to carry them one more generation, to pass them to someone who would do the same. The tradition you received is the record of what those people chose to carry. Cave 4 is the record of what was carried by people whose community did not survive to keep carrying it. Both records are real. Both deserve to be read with the same seriousness. The difference between them is not one of truth or quality or sacred authority. The difference is one of survival. And survival, as the history of these fragments makes clear, is not a judgment about worth. It is a description of what happened. The light tables at the Israel Antiquities Authority are still in use. The conversation that began in the desert above the Dead Sea, in the copying rooms of a community that believed it was living at the edge of history, has not ended. It has simply changed hands many times, and it is still moving forward, one recovered fragment at a time. Before you go, I want to ask you something directly. If you could recover one fragment from Cave 4, just one piece, and know with certainty what it said and where it belonged, what would you want it to contain? Not what scholarship predicts, not what seems historically most significant, what you would want it to say, a missing chapter, a name, a sentence that answered something, a line of prayer, a rule that explained something you had never understood, a word that connected something you had always felt was separate. Leave it in the comments. I read everyone, and the conversations that happen in this community. The honest ones. The ones where people bring their real questions rather than their settled conclusions, are among the most valuable things this kind of work makes possible, because a tradition that survived in pieces when it could not survive whole is not finished asking its questions, and neither are we.